Hi, good afternoon. My name is Rafael Kevin Einagal, and I will be discussing methods in quantitative research. Research methods are specific procedures for collecting and analyzing data. Quantitative methods allow you to test a hypothesis by systematically collecting and analyzing data. Developing your research methods is an integral part of your research design. When planning your methods, there are two key decisions you will make. First, decide how you will collect the data. In this process, your methods depend on what type of data you need to answer your research questions. And secondly, decide how you will analyze the data that you will be collecting. Before we start today's topic, which is methods in quantitative research, let's take a look at this picture. Well, millions saw the apple fall, but only Isaac Newton was the first to ask why. So let's think about this. Researchers are actually people who would like to inquire the rationale of every phenomenon. And this separates researchers from ordinary individual who just tries to become inquisitives. So, as you can see, because of the researchers, a lot of development has been created, has been discovered, just like gravity by Isaac Newton. This definition, taken from Aliaga and Gunderson in 2000, describes what we mean by quantitative research methods very well. According to her, quantitative research is explaining phenomena by collecting numerical data that are analyzed using mathematical based methods. And this is in particularly called statistics. So this is what separates quantitative research from qualitative research. When planning your research methods in research, there are two key decisions that you will make. First, decide how you will collect the data. Second, decide how you will analyze the data. Now, let's discuss data collection and how it affects your methods in research. First, think, will it be qualitative or quantitative? So will your data take the form of words or numbers? If words, it would be qualitative. If numbers, of course, it's quantitative. Now, what are the sources of your data? Primary or secondary? Will you collect original data yourself, or will you use data that has already been collected by someone else? Descriptive or experimental? Now, will you take measurements of something as it is? That would be descriptive. Or will you perform an experiment, may it be in laboratory or in a natural setting? Now, in data analysis, for quantitative data, you can use statistical analysis. These are the methods that we use to test relationships between variables. For qualitative data, you can use methods such as thematic analysis to interpret patterns and meanings in the data. Data is the information that you collect for the purposes of answering your research question. The data collection methods you use depend on the type of data that you will be needing. Your choice of qualitative or quantitative data collection depends on the type of knowledge that you would like to develop. Now take a look at the following. So if it's qualitative data, as you can see, the examples are more on texts. So technically, it's more on textile contents. Okay. While in quantitative data, we have numbers or statistical results. Now here are other examples of the two types of data. On the left side, we have qualitative. On the right side, we have the quantitative data. Another example is this one. If you take a look at an oil painting, we can actually describe it both in qualitative and quantitative means. On the left hand side, let's discuss it through qualitative means. An oil painting can be described as mostly blue or green in color. It smells old and musty. The texture shows brush strokes of oil paints. The scenery is like a peaceful one, and the brush strokes are very masterful. On the other hand, if we discuss it in quantitative means, we can say that it's 10 by 14 inches in dimensions. The weight is like 8.5 pounds. The surface area of painting is 140 square inches. And it costs like 1,200. So technically, if we can say, we can actually conclude that quantitative data are focused on numerical information, while qualitative data are focused on words. Okay? Now, for questions about ideas, experiences, and meanings, or to study something that can't be described numerically, you need to collect qualitative data. If you want to develop a more mechanistic understanding of a topic, or your research involves hypothesis testing, you need to collect quantitative data. So here are the pros and the cons of using qualitative and quantitative data. So in qualitative data, as you can see, it's very flexible. It can be conducted with a very small samples. While the disadvantages are it can be analyzed statistically, and it's difficult to standardize the research, meaning you cannot generalize it to a broader population. But your research is true to your samples. Now, quantitative research, it can be used to systematically describe large collection of things. It generates reproductive or reproducible knowledge, meaning we can replicate it. The disadvantages are as follows. It requires statistical training to analyze data. But the good thing right now is that even though you're not really good in mathematics or statistics, we have software to do it for you. It also requires larger samples so that we can generalize your results. Now, quantitative observations are as follows, or examples would be, they are characterized by numerical measure. Quantitative techniques includes the following. From the word quantity, it's a collection of numbers. Like, for example, the height, weight, age, and so on and so forth. Qualitative observations includes phenomenon or event that can be observed through our five senses. So the techniques that we used are from the word itself, quality. We collect data in the form of words or statements of our respondents. Now, what about primary and secondary data? Well, primary data is any original information that you collect for the purpose of answering your research questions. Example, we have surveys, observations, and experiments. Secondary data is information that has been collected by other researchers. Like, for example, we have the government census or previous scientific studies. Your RRL is an example of a secondary data. If you're exploring a novel research question, you'll probably need to collect primary data. But if you want to synthesize existing knowledge, analyze historical trends, or identify patterns on a large scale, secondary data might be a better choice. In descriptive research, you collect data about your study without intervening. You're just an observant there, but you don't manipulate anything. Okay? The validity of your research will depend on your sampling method. In experimental research, you're you systematically intervene in a process and measure the outcome. So the validity of your research will depend on your experimental designs. Well, we have a lot of experimental designs though, which will be discussed later on. Now, to conduct an experiment, you need to be able to vary your independent variable. We call that as manipulation. So, precisely measure your independent variable as well and control for other confounding variables. If it is practically and ethically possible, this method is the best choice for answering questions about causality or the cause and effect. Now, here are some research methods for collecting data. So take a look at the first two. So these are our focus for today. We have quantitative measurements of data through experiment and surveys. So the rest of the research approaches like interview, focus group, discussions, observations, literature review, and case studies, these are the methods or approaches that we use in qualitative research. Your data analysis method will also depend on the type of data you collect and how you prepare it for analysis. Data can often be analyzed both quantitatively and qualitatively. For example, survey responses could be analyzed qualitatively by studying the meanings of responses or quantitatively by studying the frequencies of these responses. Like for example, in such cases, when you say frequency, if the number of times that a lot of respondents are saying the same answer or the theme of the same answer. In qualitative analysis methods, we use this to understand the words, ideas, and experiences. You can use it to interpret data that were collected. From an open-ended survey and interview questions, literature reviews, case studies, and so on and so forth, we use them rather than the numbers itself. And of course, the sampling methods would be focused on non-probability sampling. Qualitative analysis tends to be quite flexible and relies on the judgment of the researcher. So you have to reflect carefully on the choice of and assumptions. Now, quantitative analysis uses numbers and statistics to understand frequencies, averages, and correlations, or the cause and effect relationships. You can use quantitative analysis to interpret data that was collected either during an experiment or using probability sampling methods. Now, because the data is collected and analyzed in a statistical valid way, the results of quantitative analysis can be easily standardized and shared among researchers. So, this is one of the strengths of the quantitative methods. We can generalize the findings. Let's answer some frequently asked questions. First one. What's the difference between quantitative and qualitative research methods? Well, the answer is this one. Quantitative research deals with numbers and statistics, while qualitative research deals with words and meanings. Quantitative methods allow you to test a hypothesis by systematically collecting and analyzing data, while qualitative methods allow you to explore ideas and experiences in depth. Now, what is sampling? Second question. Well, a sample is a subset of individuals from a larger population. Sampling means selecting the group that you will actually collect data from in your research. For example, if you are researching the opinions of students in your university, you could survey a sample of 100 students. So instead of the entire university population, like it would take like 2,000 or more. In statistics, sampling allows you to test a hypothesis about the characteristics of a population. Now, how do I decide which research methods to use? If you want to measure something or to test a hypothesis, use quantitative methods. If you want to explore ideas, thoughts, and meanings, use qualitative methods. If you want to analyze a large amount of readily available data, use secondary data. If you want data specific to your purposes with control over how it is generated, then use primary data. If you want to establish causality between variables, use experimental methods. If you want to understand the characteristics of a research subject, well, just use descriptive methods. Now, what's the difference between a method and methodology? Well, methodology refers to a very larger entity or a rationale of your research project. Well, methods are like the specific tools that you use to collect and analyze data from sample to experimentations to surveys and statistical tests. So, to easily understand, in scientific papers like concept papers that you submit for publication, we use methods. While methodology, we use that for your thesis and dissertation during your graduate school. Now, how to get quantitative data? Well, we have a lot of different methods of collection of data. You can use survey, you can use checklist, you can use Likert Scale questionnaire, and in some instances, you can even use the documents available already. That would be called as your documentary analysis. So, why do we collect quantitative data? Well, qualitative survey questions can run the risk of being too vague. So to avoid confusing your respondents, you may want to eschew questions like, what do you think about our internet service? Instead, you could ask a close-ended quantitative question like in the following example. So our internet service is reliable. Is it always? Most of the time? About half the time? Once in a while? Or never? So you use this one in your survey questions, like which is a Likert scale. This one is a 5-point Likert scale. So you can assign values like 1 for never, 2 for once in a while, 3 for about half the time, 4 for most of the time, and always would be 5. Then you can get the mean score of every individual, and then the mean score of an entire group, and then analyze the total mean, and that will be the level of internet service in terms of reliability. So qualitative questions usually take longer to answer, and sometimes our respondents would be kind of lazy enough to answer like open-ended survey questions. So it would be hard for them to write down, especially those that are not good in writing. This one, they can just choose their answers. Now, quantitative survey questions are just, from the word itself, it's very quantifiable. We can turn them into numbers for easy understanding. Now, quantitative research methods from the book of Earl Babby emphasize objective measurements and the statistical, mathematical, or numerical analysis of data collected through polls, questionnaires, and surveys, or by manipulating pre-existing statistical data using computational techniques. Quantitative research focuses on gathering numerical data and generalizing it across groups of people or to explain a particular phenomenon. Now, why do we do quantitative research? Well, to answer this question, we need to understand when to do quantitative research. If your study aims to find out the answer to an inquiry through numerical evidence, then you should make use of the quantitative research. In general, use qualitative research at the beginning of a design process to uncover innovations. Use quantitative research at the end of a design process to measure improvement as well. According to Pierre Bourdieu, a typical arc to the narrative research by first investigating economic class in an open-ended fashion. He once established what he thought was going on, and he tested these ideas in larger surveys. So that's a good example of a quantitative research. The main activity for which quantitative research is especially suited is the testing of hypotheses. Now, let's take a look at the differences between qualitative and quantitative research. On the left are the characteristics of a qualitative research, on the right for quantitative research. Now, one of the strengths of the quantitative research is that it is very objective in nature. So the researcher is like an outside observer of the phenomenon. He does not immerse himself into the research process itself, unlike qualitative research. And if you could notice, it's focused more on the numbers and testing of theories. So that is how quantitative research is differentiated from qualitative. Now, here are the different designs in quantitative research. Now, a design is something that is like a blueprint of your research paper. It dictates what you need to do and what are the things that should be included in your research. So, we have 4 levels. The first one is descriptive research, followed by correlational or explanatory research. Third is quasi-experimental or causal comparative researches. And finally, we have experimental, or in some books, to emphasize its being experimental in nature, they call it as true experimental. Now, descriptive research is a type of research that exists and may help to uncover new facts and meaning. Its major purpose is to observe, describe, document aspects of a situation as it naturally occurs. So as you can see, there is no manipulation of data here. We observe data as it naturally occurs. And of course, no random selection of groupings. We don't randomize them. And the good thing about descriptive research, they provide a knowledge base. Now, examples of descriptive researches. First one, knowledge level of students in geometry. So here, we conducted a survey using a validated test question. Well, the test questions could have been validated by a mathematics expert as well as a language expert. And then the tests will be administered to students. Then the mean of scores of students are tabulated and analyzed according to their groups. It could be age, gender, civil status, and so on. So in that process, we just describe the knowledge level of students without any treatment methods at all, without providing any intervention. The next one, we have netiquette awareness of baby boomers. Well, netiquette is ethics in the use of gadgets, internet, and social media. Well, baby boomers are those people who were born in the 40s, 50s, or 60s. So, awareness is actually qualitative in nature. But if you create a Likert scale, then it can easily be quantified. So, a survey is conducted using validated Likert scale questionnaire, after which the mean scores of respondents are tabulated and analyzed to determine the level of awareness. So we did not manipulate our variables here, our participants. The next one, extent of healthcare services received by pediatric patients. If you could notice, extent is also broad in nature, but if you can make a checklist and then put here like 9 out of 10 healthcare services were conducted, then an individual would have an extent of 9 out of 10 or 90% extent of healthcare services. So Percentage frequency of the results is generated and analyzed per healthcare services in this process. Now, what are the advantages and the disadvantages? Well, descriptive researches are generally very quick, easy, and cheap to conduct. Exposure data often only are available in the area. Differences in exposure between areas may be bigger than that at the individual level, but it's actually quite easily examined. Well, a descriptive study is limited to a description of the occurrence of a disease or a treatment or a phenomenon in a particular population. This one is usually used to test hypotheses. Well, the weaknesses of case reports and case series are that they have no comparison or control group. Okay? And they cannot be tested for statistical associations, and they are especially prone to publication bias. So when I say publication bias, these are some of the cases wherein reports or series describe the effectiveness of an intervention. Let us discuss the second type of quantitative research, which is correlational research. Now, quantitative correlational research aims to systematically investigate and explain the nature of the relationship between variables in the real world. So often, the quantifiable data, the things that we can quantify or count from descriptive studies, are frequently analyzed in this way. So it's just like the two descriptive studies are being analyzed or combined to make a correlational research. Now, correlational research studies go beyond simply by describing what exists and are concerned with systematically investigating relationships between two or more variables of interests. So, such studies only describe and attempt to explain the nature of relationships that exist and do not examine causality. So, a good example is this one: awareness and practice of farmers on the use of pesticides. So, as we can actually see here, we can determine the level of awareness and the level of practice of farmers. So, these two are separate descriptive research. You can have a study about awareness on the use of pesticides and practice of the use of pesticides. So, in this process, a survey is conducted to determine the level of awareness first, while at the same time, the level of practice is also being surveyed through a Likert Scale. Now, Pearson's R correlation is used to determine the relationship between awareness and practice. Okay. Now, what are the advantages of correlational research? First, neither variable goes through a manipulative process, so there is no manipulation of variables. When you choose a correlational research study to review variables, then neither one goes through a manipulative process. Two different data collection methods are available with correlational research, and these are very nice to use. The data gathered from a correlational research study can come from either naturalistic observation or archival data. So these are the two data collection methods available. Now, because a correlational research study occurs in real-life situations, the data that gets gathered from this work is typically more applicable to everyday encounters. So meaning it's very practical. Researchers can determine the direction and strength of each relationship. The variables that get studied with correlational research help us to find the direction and strength of each relationship. Now, what are the limitations? Correlational research only uncovers relationships. So the benefit of a correlational research study is that it can uncover relationships that may have not been previously known. What it does not provide is a conclusive reason for why that connection exists in the first place. It won't determine what variables have the most influence. A correlational research study can help to determine the connections that variables share with a specific phenomenon. What this work cannot produce is information regarding which variable is responsible for influencing the other. Now, correlational research can be very time consuming as well. Although the benefits of a correlational research study can be tremendous, it can also be expensive and time consuming to achieve an outcome. Extraneous variables might interfere with the information that is gathered. So there is no guarantee that additional influences will stay out of the correlational research study. Like for example, in this research, we can see that awareness and practice may have a relationship, but of course, it isn't just the awareness that may affect the level of practice of farmers and the use of pesticides. There could have been other reasons like economic status or their culture themselves. So we could not really do a conclusive result regarding that. But we can establish that indeed there is a relationship between the level of awareness and the level of practice. Now, before we go to the remaining two types of quantitative research methods or designs, let's discuss the following terms: manipulation, treatment, control, and randomization. These are very important, especially in quantitative research that deals with quasi and true experimental methods. Now, manipulation, the researcher manipulates the levels of the independent variable. This usually means that you are looking at the effect of some treatment on one group of subjects. So these group of subjects are called the treatment group. That's the first group. And then compare them to another group of subjects that did not receive any treatment. We call that group as the control group, or sometimes called as the placebo group, the group that was controlled so that they will not receive any treatment at all. Now, the treatment group is the independent variable that gets manipulated, while the control group is the independent variable that remains the same. From the word itself, it's being controlled. All variables around it is controlled. Randomization refers to assigning of subjects to at least two comparison groups. It could be one treatment group and one control group, or several treatment group and a control group. With randomization, extraneous variables are evenly distributed between or among groups. Even variables you have not thought about yet may be controlled through randomization. So this is very important with regards to experimental research. Well, take note, this is not the same thing as random sampling or random selection. So, like the one that will be discussed by the other discussant about sampling methods, it's different than that. Okay? Now, let's have the quasi-experimental research. This is a type of research that attempts to establish cause and effect relationship among variables. So these types of design are very similar to true experiments, but of course, there are some key differences. An independent variable is identified, but it is not manipulated in some cases by the experimenter. And the effects of the independent variable and the dependent variable are usually measured. Now, it is not the same as true experimental research because these studies lack one or both of the essential properties of randomization and the use of control group. So usually there is no control group in quasi-experimental research. The researcher does not randomly assign groups and must use ones that are naturally formed or pre-existing groups. Like for example, you will be doing an action research between among the students of grade 11. So you will just choose one section and another section. So as you can see, you did not randomly assign all your respondents in any of these sections. So you just choose them. The major drawback with quasi-experimental is that compared to experimental research, it has a weakness in that it is not possible to deliver cause and effect results. In other words, we cannot infer from quasi-experimental research that, for example, doing one causes a particular phenomenon, like smoking cigarettes may cause cancer. So, identified control groups exposed to the treatment variable are studied and compared to groups that are not. Now, what are the types of quasi-experimental design? So, we have the non-equivalent groups design. So, this is also known as between subjects design, in which participants have not been randomly assigned to conditions. So, well, just like what I told you earlier, it's like the individuals are just being there between them. They are just being tested by that. Now, what about pre-test post-test design? So the dependent variable is measured once, that is before the treatment is implemented, and once after it is implemented. So like for example, you're going to determine the level of knowledge of your students before and after you applied like a flipped classroom intervention. So first, you will test their level of knowledge prior to conducting the flipped classroom method of teaching. You determine the results of their test, and then afterwards, after doing a flipped classroom interaction, you will conduct another test to determine if their level of knowledge has increased. That is comparing the pre-test and the post-test. Now, what about interrupted time series design? Well, this is somewhat the same with the PPD, or the pre-test post-test design. However, instead of just measuring the results before and after, you measure it at different intervals over a period of time. Like for example, you measure it before. That's the initial measurement, and then after 2 weeks you measure, and then so on and so forth. Now, combination designs, from the word itself, it's a combination of the three types of quasi-experimental research. Now, a good example is this one: gamifications in enhancing performance in math. Well, the independent variable here is the use of gamification techniques, while the dependent variable is their performance in mathematics. So we use human participants. We don't use randomization here because we only use one group of participants. Let's say, for example, just one section. They will be given gamification interventions. So as you can see, we manipulated that entire section to utilize gamification instead of the usual lecture discussion. After which, the performance level in math of these students are tested. Usually it's tested before and after the intervention. If we do that, we have the pre-test post-test design. And this is a quasi-experimental. Now, what are the advantages of a quasi-experimental research? Since it involves manipulation of an independent variable without the random assignment of participants to conditions or orders of conditions, it is a little bit easier than to set up than the true experimental. Well, quasi-experimental research eliminates the directionality problem because it involves the manipulation of the independent variable. It does not eliminate the problem of confounding variables. However, because it does not involve random assignment to conditions. So for these reasons, Quasi-experimental research is generally higher in internal validity than correlational studies, but usually lower than true experiments. Now let's go to the last the last quantitative research, which is experimental research, often called true experimentation because we use the scientific method to establish the causality among groups of variables. So it is often thought of as a laboratory study, but usually you can do it in a natural setting too. Now, a true experiment is any study where an effort is made to identify and impose, take note, control over all other variables except one. Let's say, for example, we study a certain group of mosquitoes or cockroaches. So these mosquitoes should be of the same age, the same parent, the same generation, the same sexes, so that an experimental research can be done easily. Now, in human participants, this is, however, very hard because in humans, we cannot make sure that our participants would be the same, like the same sex, the same parents, the same age. So that's why for human participants, usually quasi-experimental research is mostly applicable. Now, in experimental research, an independent variable is manipulated to determine the effects on the dependent variables. Subjects are randomly assigned to experimental treatments rather than identified in naturally occurring groups. So some examples are the following. First, the post-test only control group design. So the subjects are randomly selected and assigned to the two groups. So take note, there are two groups, the control and the experimental group. Usually the experimental group is also called as the treatment group. And only the experimental group is, of course, being treated. So after close observation, both groups are post-tested and the conclusion is drawn from the difference between these groups. Now the second one, the pretest post-test control group design. So first, subjects are randomly assigned to two groups, for, just like control and treatment or experimental group. Both are presented, but only the experimental group is treated. So after close observation, both groups are post-tested to measure the degree of change in every group. So as you can see, there is a pretest and a post-test in this one. Now the Solomon 4 group design, it's a combination of pretest only and the pretest post-test control groups. In this case, the randomly selected subjects are placed into 4 groups. Here's an example of an experimental research under the post-test only control group design. So here, the title is Development of Mosquito Repellent from Mentha piperita. Mentha piperita is also known as the peppermint. Now the thing about scientific experimentation is that we use the scientific names of our subjects. In this case, our subjects are plant and animals. So M. piperita is manipulated in 3 concentrations. We have 75%, 85%, 95%. And these manipulated groups or treatment is the experimental or the treatment group. Now, a placebo, let's say a plain water, is also prepared. In this case, this is the control group. We did not add any mosquito repellent here in the form of Mentha piperita. So the treatment and the control group are usually replicated in at least 3 trials. So when you say trials, it means replications. The number of times that you are going to test a certain treatment group. Like for example, so instead of just 1 for each concentration, we have 75. Let's say if it's going to be 3 trials, there will be 3 75%. There will be 3 85% and 3 95% under that group, which will be treated. Now the same type, age, sex, and species of mosquitoes are used. So here we manipulate the independent variable, which is the mosquitoes. Now, mosquitoes are randomly assigned to the treatment and control group, and we call that as randomization. Now, this is an example of trials or replications. On the right side, you can see the legend. These are the treatment and the control groups. So we have different control groups in the form of different concentrations of plants. I mean, these are the different treatment groups or experimental groups, and the control group is just one. So it's replicated and randomly assigned. Usually it's blind randomization, a double blind randomization to prevent bias. So in the first trial, the groups that are being tested are as follows. We have A, L, K, J, C, M, G, F, I, G, B, F, I. So they are randomly selected there. In the second trial, we have K, A, so forth. And in the third trial, we have M, B, K, and so on. So they are randomly assigned in 3 trials. But take note, they are actually being tested at the same time. Now, what are the advantages and the disadvantages of the experimental research? Well, it provides researchers with a high level of control by being able to isolate specific variables. It becomes possible to determine if a potential outcome is indeed viable. Take note, there is no limit to the subject matter or industry involved. You can use this in medicine, biology, physics, and so on and so forth, even in education. Experimental research is not limited to a specific industry or type of idea. It can be used in a wide variety of situations. Experimental research provides conclusions that are specific. Now, because experimental research provides such a high level of control, it can produce results that are specific and relevant with consistency. The results of experimental research can also be duplicated. So experimental research is straightforward, basic form of research that allows for its duplication when the same variables are controlled by others. The natural settings can be replicated with even faster speeds. When conducting research within a laboratory environment, it becomes possible to replicate conditions that could take a long time so that the variables can be tested appropriately. This allows researchers to have a greater control of the extraneous variables which may exist as well, limiting the unpredictability of nature as each variable is being carefully studied. So experimental research allows cause and effect to be determined. The manipulation of variables allows for researchers to be able to look at various cause and effect relationships that a product, theory, or idea can produce. Now, what are the disadvantages? It is highly prone to human error due to its dependency on variable control, which may not be properly implemented. These errors could eliminate the validity of the experiment and the research being conducted. And just like the other 2 research previously, it is time consuming. So much time is spent on testing dependent variables and waiting for the effect of the manipulation of dependent variables to manifest. It is very risky and may have ethical complications that cannot be ignored. This is common in medical research, where failed trials may lead to a patient's death or a deteriorating health condition. Lastly, human responses in experimental research can be difficult to measure. That is why extensive clinical trials are needed if human participants are included. So, just like the creation of the COVID-19 vaccine, it takes a while for it to be fully tested and for it to be determined to be fully functional. Now, these are the questions that we need to ask ourselves so that we can determine what type of quantitative research we're going to use. So the first question is there a treatment? If there is a treatment, then we go on the right side. Okay? If there's none, you ask the next question. Is the primary purpose examination of relationships? If no, then we use descriptive design. Okay, descriptive research. Now, if yes, will the sample be studied as a single group? And of course, if yes, then correlational design can be utilized. Now, let's go back to the first question. Is there a treatment? If there is a treatment, then we ask the next question. Is the treatment tightly controlled by the researcher? If it is not controlled, or there is no control there, no randomization, we use quasi-experimental design. Now, if it is tightly controlled, and if there is randomization, then we use experimental designs. So take note, on the left hand side here, when you from the question, is there a treatment, we can simply say that the descriptive and the correlational research studies are mainly for describing and identifying relationships as it occurs naturally. But if we add interventions or manipulations, we use either a quasi-experimental or an experimental design. Now, quantitative research primarily utilizes probability sampling. And the sampling method that we will be using to determine a sample size is the Sloven's formula. This will be discussed by one of our discussants. Now, probability sampling makes sure that the variables are highly randomized and there is a low subjectivity level, as well as we can highly generalize our results. Now, what is generalizability? It refers to the extent to which the findings not only represent the samples but also the general population. And this is one of the strengths of quantitative research. Unlike in qualitative research, wherein your result will only be true to your participants in a small sample, like a maximum of 10 respondents. Unlike in quantitative research, it's composed of a lot of samples, a lot of respondents. So you can highly generalize the results because of sampling. Now, what are the statistical methods in quantitative research? Well, we have the Pearson's R, the t-test, ANOVA. Okay? So to determine the relationship between variables, we use the Pearson's R, which we can use in some of the researches that we have. The t-test as well to determine the significant differences. The same goes with ANOVA, the differences between the statistical differences between variables of more than 2. And of course, we have the multiple regression. Now, the descriptive statistics that we can use are as follows. It usually answers questions like, what is the level of awareness of students on social media ethics? So we use here the following statistics or statistical tools. We have mean, standard deviation, frequency, and percentage. On the other hand, inferential statistics are used for questions like, is there a significant difference between the level, or for example, the level of knowledge of students when grouped according to age, sex, and civil status? So we use ANOVA. Let's start with t-test. We use t-test if we are only comparing 2 variables. Like for example, in sex, we only have male and female. So we compare the differences between their scores, the male and the female. We use t-test. But for variables with for cases wherein there are more than 2 variables, like let's say Civil status. So we have married, single, we have cohabitation, or we have widowed, or something like that. So there are more than two variables to determine the significant differences. Then we use ANOVA. Now, furthermore, if we could determine that there really is a statistical differences between the variables, we may add post hoc statistics like LSD and a lot more. Now, for questions like, is there a significant relationship between the different variables? Like, for example, we have there um, level of motivation and level of knowledge. We would like to determine if there is a significant relationship between the motivation level of students and their grades in a certain subject. So we can actually utilize Pearson's R for that. Now for nominal variables, we can use chi-square. And of course, these are the things like the significant difference, significant relationship questions in your research objectives. These are the statistical hypotheses that you include in your research paper. So instead of saying, is there a significant difference? You can say, for a null hypothesis, you can say there is no significant difference, or there is no significant relationship. And we try to accept or reject these statistical hypotheses. Now, what are the advantages of quantitative research? Quantitative research design is an excellent way of finding results and proving or disproving a hypothesis. So the structure has not changed for centuries, so is the standard across many scientific fields and disciplines. Now, after statistical analysis of the results, a comprehensive answer is usually reached, and the results can be legitimately discussed and published. Quantitative experiments also filter out external factors, if properly designed, and so the results gained can be seen as real, and of course, it's always unbiased. Quantitative experiments are useful for testing the results gained by a series of qualitative experiments, leading to a final answer and a narrowing down of possible directions for follow-up research to take. What about the disadvantages? Now, quantitative experiments can be difficult and expensive, and it requires a lot of time to perform. They must be carefully planned to ensure that there is complete randomization and correct designation of groups. Quantitative studies usually require extensive statistical analysis, which can be difficult due to most scientists are actually not statisticians. So the field of statistical study is a whole scientific discipline and can be difficult for non-mathematicians. Right now, the really good thing is that we have software to determine the results effectively and smoothly, like SPSS, or we have the QI macros. The requirements for the successful statistical confirmation of results are very stringent, which with very few experiments comprehensively proving a hypothesis, there is usually some ambiguity which requires retesting and refinement to the design. So this means another investment of time and resources must be committed to fine-tune the results. And quantitative research design also tends to generate only proved or unproven results, with there being very little room for gray areas and uncertainty, unlike in qualitative. For social sciences, education, anthropology, and psychology, human nature is a lot more complex than just a simple yes or no response. Now, to conduct your methodology, we can follow the research cycle, like identify the research area, design research study. That's the part where we do the methodology, the green part there. Then you conduct the research, then analyze the result, and publish your research.
Now, what's the difference between methods and research methodology? So, as mentioned earlier, methodology is more of an extensive description of what you did or what you're going to do with your research. Well, the research methods, they are just like the summary of what you're going to do in your research. Now, this is a sample content of a quantitative research method. So, um, in your scientific paper, you start with the research design, you define it. Like here, we have quasi-experimental research, the pretest post-test design. So, you discuss that in paragraph form. Second will be the research locale. So, here, I utilize my own school, Libaco National Forestry Vocational High School. So you discuss what this school is all about. The statistics regarding how many students are enrolled in that place. Next, respondents. I utilized grade 11 students in my study, so I will put here grade 11 students and then specify the criteria and the parameters, what specific grade 11 students they are. That's in for my respondents. Now, ethical consideration, it would include your narrative of how you're going to conduct your research, like the consent, waiver, permits. Now, instrument that you will be utilizing in the process, you need to discuss them. Here, I utilize 3 instruments and what type of reliability I will be using. And of course, you could also include there data collection method, how you're going to conduct the research, and finally, your data analysis. Here, my data analysis will be in the form of statistical treatment. We have mean, standard deviation, t-test, and Pearson's R. Okay, how about an example of the methods or materials and methods in an experimental research? It's more of a flow chart, I mean. So I started with collection of extracts, preparation of treatments, the process of saponification, the setup, the trial, the testing, and of course the statistical analysis. So it's a little bit different compared to the methodology format of descriptive, correlational, and quasi-experimental. Now, take note of the following. Quantitative methods are usually decided based on your research questions, data collection, and data analysis. So, you need to ask yourself, what are you going to study about? Then formulate your research questions, and based on that, you can determine if it's going to be quantitative or qualitative. Now, quantitative research has its main purpose in quantification of data, and to examine relationships among variables, also to determine causality and the generalization of results. So that is basically all for quantitative methods. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good day.
To simplify, quantitative research methods are most effective if you want data that are quantifiable and